Hi, boys and girls. Hopefully the lighting's better. I didn't fix that window yet. I know I promised to the last time I was on last week. It's been a pretty busy week, so you know. Anyway, today I wanted to talk about the difference between a sport utility vehicle, an SUV, and a crossover, which are also often called crossover SUVs, uh, because there's a very, I don't know, muddy water. There's the difference is often misunderstood, or people don't know. It's sort of like Congress with porn. They know it when they see it, right? Uh, so most people can look and they can see and they can say, yeah, that's an SUV, or they see something else and they say, yeah, that's a crossover. The major difference is the design of the vehicle, the build of it. So an SUV traditionally will have a body on frame design, which um, sounds nice and complicated, and most people are going to have to Google that if they bother to learn what it is. But what it means is that it's a solid frame, just like a truck. So just like a pickup truck or a large heavy vehicle, commercial vehicles, anything like that, they have a heavy frame, a single frame. So it's the frame is one long piece, or it's several pieces put together, but it doesn't have crumple zones, break zones, any of that. It's one giant solid piece. So it'll be a frame, which will be rails like this with the cross members. Um, a crossover is designed like a car, which will use a unibody understructure. So the unibody means that it's a single body, but but it's not a single unit. So the framing and will be in at least two parts. Usually, it's in four or five, maybe even six if the vehicle's big enough. But generally, it's in uh, at least two parts, usually four. So the frame itself will have three distinct pieces. You'll have a front piece where the engine and drivetrain or powertrain will be. So you'll have the engine, probably the transmission. That will be the front piece. You'll have the passenger compartment bit. So that'll be the middle part where where the passenger compartment is, so where the seating is and everything. And then you'll have the back part, which will be where the rear axle, if there is one, usually there is, or the rear spindles. It's where the rear section of the car is. You can think of it as the trunk of the hatchback. So the car will be in those three pieces. The framing, so that's the underframe, will be there. The fourth piece of that frame is the body itself. The body has a frame to it. So there's a frame that the body parts are put onto. That becomes an integral part of the car's design. So when we talk about safety, you talk about like crash testing and stuff, you'll see crumple zones, things like that. That is that unibody structure being made to smush at specific points in very designed ways so that it helps the passengers. So usually the body framing will create a roll cage around the passengers. You can think of that like this. So you're sitting in here, it's like this. Everything around it is made to crumple in and under or over or around it rather than into it. So it doesn't go inside when it crumples. So a unibody vehicle structurally is much safer than a body on frame truck-based vehicle, um, in terms of the ability to absorb a crash. So the major difference when you're just looking at a vehicle will usually be the lift, the amount of space uh, between the wheel and the wheel well, the axle and the well. A truck-based vehicle is never lower than the axle. So in other words, the because of the way it has to be designed, when you step into the vehicle, you have to step over the frame. So it will always be higher than the midpoint of the axle, or on equal plane with the midpoint of the axle, because of the way they have to be designed. A unibody vehicle, you can step into it. So the frame can be inside from the body point, or it can be lower than where you're stepping in, or it can be higher and you step over it and in. There's always a tub. Um, the other thing that's kind of a sure giveaway is when the manufacturer uses terms like four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. So here in the US, we very distinctly define, just by vernacular, I don't think there's any rule, we very distinctly define the difference between four-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. Four-wheel drive will have a transfer case that physically changes or moves power to from one axle to the other axle. That's a geared case, so it's gearing that's making that change. Whereas all-wheel drive uh, um, will have a differential doing that, which is not geared, so it doesn't have multiple gears to it. So that's really the only uh, technical difference between four-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. There are differences in capabilities and other things, but it's not really relevant here. Also, most four-wheel drive vehicles will, or most SUVs, most sport utility vehicles, uh, um, they will look like a truck. They'll feel like a truck. They'll look like a truck. They'll have a high ground clearance. They'll have wider track, heavier axles, that sort of thing. So, using some market examples. So just looking, driving down dealer row in your town, looking at what's on the lots. Uh, you'll see like a Chevrolet Tahoe. I think it's Chevrolet. Did Chevrolet do that, or is it GMC? I think it's Chevy. So you see a Tahoe. That's very, very much an SUV. You see a Kia Sorento. That's very much a crossover. You see a Subaru Forester, definitely a crossover. You see a Ford Expedition. That one blurs the line, but it is an SUV. There are a couple of things from Ford that are kind of blurring that little distinction in terms of how they're designed, but they are still very much SUVs. They're still very much body on frame when you boil it down. There are a few other examples, but for the most part, it's fairly obvious when you look at it. But again, the major difference is going to be in that frame design. So how the underpinnings of the vehicle are designed. Body on frame or solid frame, and a unibody or multi-frame put together. That's the major difference between a crossover and an SUV. Hopefully this has been helpful to somebody. That's been my weekly. I know I'm a little late this week. I planned on doing these sometime around midday, and it's almost 2 o'clock my time right now. But life gets around.